Today's conversation is rooted in lived experience. Caregiving is not one moment in time for many people. It's a thread that weaves through life in different ways. So stay tuned and we'll get into it. Hi, Dr. Lakelyn here. Welcome to Caregiver Chats. I'm a gerontologist and caregiving advocate for Home Instead, an honor company. I'm so glad you're taking the time to join me. These conversations are a space for learning, reflection, and support, and I invite you to subscribe to Caregiver Chats on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget, I love hearing from you. You can connect with me on Instagram at Caregiver Chats Podcast. For many caregivers, the journey is not linear. It evolves across seasons of life, across relationships, and often across decades. Today's guest understands that in a deeply personal way. Debbie Weiss has been caregiving from multiple angles for over 40 years. Her journey began as a teenager caring for her father after a stroke. Later, she raised a son with autism and journeyed alongside her husband as he faced cancer and ongoing mental health challenges. Supporting a loved one through both physical illness and mental health challenges brought a unique and often invisible layer to her caregiving experience. Over time, these experiences shaped not only her life, but also her perspective. Today, Debbie is an author, speaker, and the host of the podcast Maybe I Can, where she shares honest reflections on resilience, growth, and what it means to keep going even in life's hardest moments. I listened to her story and knew that I wanted to bring her voice to this community. Debbie, welcome. I am so excited to have you joining me today on Caregiver Chats.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really am excited for our conversation.
Me too. And Debbie, what drew me to your caregiving story is that you have experienced so many different caregiving roles over your lifetime. And so I would love for you to take us back to the first caregiving role that you stepped into at the very young age of 17. So can you tell us about that?
Sure. The day after I graduated high school, my father, who was only days shy of turning 46, had a massive stroke. Luckily, he survived, and he actually lived for 30 years, almost to the day. And my parents soon divorced after he had the stroke, and so I was his caregiver for 30 years, starting, at that young age. Nothing,
Wow.
Nothing I don't think could have prepared me for that journey.
Right. Well, yeah, especially at such a young age, you don't expect to be navigating that role, let alone what it's like to be a graduate and to try to kind of go through young adulthood. You're probably figuring out who you are as a person and supporting your dad. I can only imagine how really that experience has shaped your life and your approach to caregiving across your lifespan.
Absolutely. I mean, at the time when it all first happened and I became his caregiver, it was something I felt really good about. I mean, I was such a daddy's girl and he was my guy, and it was very hard to see him change and for us to swap roles at that age. You expect it when you're in your 40s or 50s, but like you said, you don't expect it at that age. And I lacked a lot of confidence and self-esteem as a kid. And I was the kind of person who was afraid to ever speak up or ask a question. I really didn't want to be seen. And when it came to my father, I knew that I had to push past those insecurities and fears because I was not going to let his care suffer because I was afraid to speak up or advocate on his behalf.
Wow. What an interesting kind of growth opportunity in a way for you to kind of step into that role and to grow and to stretch. I sometimes hear caregivers say, this is the hardest role I've ever had, but it has helped me realize that I can do hard things and I can stretch and grow and fulfill roles that I never thought possible. And we actually recently had a stroke family caregiver on our podcast. She has a network of support for family caregivers that are impacted by stroke, because we talked about how, everyone's stroke impacts them in a little bit different
Yes.
way. And sometimes you don't always see outwardly the impact of the stroke. And so I'm sure that maybe was the case in your scenario, and navigating that can also be hard, is what we talked about with Lana.
Oh, yeah. And I think, then at the time I didn't realize it, but also the fact that, you know, I lost my father. He was still alive, but,
Yeah.
I lost kind of my hero and the man who was going to be there for me, that kind of gave me that comfort. And now he was gone, even though he was alive, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
that's something I did not realize. It took me a lot of years to realize that I never grieved that loss, and, until 30 years later when he actually passed away.
Wow. Yeah, I think a lot of people talk about that, and there's kind of a term for it, anticipatory grief, where you're kind of grieving the person while they're still alive. We talk about it a lot in the kind of the dementia space, but I think it's very interesting that you brought it up in this scenario too, because your role and dynamic, your relationship really did kind of grow and change and looked a lot different. So I can only imagine then, as you kind of go through life, you find yourself then in another caregiving role. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So my oldest son at the age of 2 was diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and then he added ADHD and depression and anxiety and a whole host of other letters, all those letter diagnoses, that he has after his name. And of course, as parents, we are all caregivers.
Mhm.
I have 2 sons, and I can say that it's not even close to the same to care for someone who has special needs. And at that time, because my son is 25 now, when he was 2, people weren't talking about autism. They didn't
Yeah.
know much about the spectrum of the disorder. And I remember being in that doctor's office with my son and my husband, and the doctor turned to us and said he has PDD-NOS, which they don't call anymore, but it's autistic spectrum disorder. And he handed us a pamphlet and said, "Good luck."
Wow.
And
Wow.
it was, "Oh, you're a mother. Mothers know best." Know best? This is first of all, it's my first child. Second of all, I know absolutely nothing about autism. I don't know what's right and like, how could I know?
Yeah.
And boy, I just remember my husband and I walking out to the parking lot, strapping my son in the car seat, and just both of us crying hysterically, hugging each other, thinking, what
Wow.
do we do? What's going to happen to him? It was terrifying.
Mm. Wow, I can only imagine again that scenario, being a mom as well, and I think we've come a long way in terms of the autism community, thankfully. So hopefully families aren't going through that same "I have nowhere to turn" kind of feeling. And over his life course, what were some of kind of the challenges or the resources that you did eventually find to help you along that journey?
So I was lucky in that I had a friend who had a daughter who was, 10 or so years older than my son. His name is Sam. And she had a lot of experience. And so she was the one who guided me. And actually, what wound up happening was, because back then there was no health insurance coverage. Everything that
Mm.
I did had to be out of pocket. And so she kind of enlightened me and helped me get a team of therapists to work with him, in addition to what early intervention was giving him, like 1 hour of speech therapy and 1 hour of, occupational therapy a week, which was really nothing.
Mhm.
And I developed a program and was paying $6,000 a month out of pocket that we did not have. It was
Wow.
terrifying, but I just felt in my heart that if I didn't explore every opportunity that I felt might be helpful for him, I would look back with a lot of regret.
Mm.
And so I remember saying to my husband, because I was the money person, I remember saying to my husband, even if we have to sell our house and live in a 1-bedroom apartment somewhere, all 4 of us, I don't care. This is our son's
Mm.
life we're talking about. And so really intensely for about 4 years, we were dealing with a home program and then dealing with what was happening or what services he was receiving in school is another whole thing. And so over the next, really his whole career in school, it was all about working with the child study team. And I had so many years where it was not a friendly relationship, let's just say that. And so
Mm.
you wind up educating yourself. And once I did, that mother's gut of no, I do not want my son doing that, or I strongly want him doing something else, it did eventually kick in. But you don't know
Mm.
the answers. It's you got to go with your gut, right? There is no
Yeah.
pill, perfect protocol. And just like with stroke victims, everybody with this diagnosis also presents very differently.
Mm. Yeah, it's such a good reminder that caregivers, they sacrifice so much financially, of their time, of their effort. They're constantly advocating for their loved one and going with their gut or trying to educate themselves. They're learning as they go. And I love that you were able to connect with that other mother
Mm.
who was a little bit further down the line to seek that wisdom and support. And I think when caregivers, no matter what disease state, no matter what stage of life, if you're able to connect with others going through it or those who maybe are a few steps ahead of you, it can be so helpful to just know you're not alone and then to learn from others that have gone before and have tried this or that. I know that caregivers talk about on our podcast all the time when they finally get connected to resources like that. It's life-changing.
Absolutely. I have always been a huge fan of support groups because, just like you said, there is nothing, it is just this sense of relief when you're sitting in a room or online, whatever it is nowadays, right, with people who just get it.
Yeah.
And especially, and I know we'll talk about in a little bit, especially I found with mental illness, because so many
Mm.
things can happen and mental illness can show itself and rear its head in quite ugly ways that other people would look at you kind of like you're crazy. And so to walk into a room, not be embarrassed to share what's happening. It's
Mm.
almost like, you're just able to take a deep breath and sigh and just know that you found your people and it means everything. And like you said, and
Mm.
not to mention that you get good ideas and resources and all the others, in addition to just feeling comfortable and comforted.
Yeah. That sense of kind of being known and seen in your role and your experience, so powerful. And you mentioned kind of mental health, and I know that as we were preparing for this call, you shared your son has struggled with some mental health, and also your husband, and that takes us to kind of your third wave of caregiving. So tell us about the care and support you were um, going through with your husband.
So my husband, he always had different physical illnesses. He always, but it was nothing that was going to, imminently kill him, let's say. And I noticed he and I worked together. I have an insurance agency and he and I worked together for 20 years. And I noticed that, he would be nervous about things that he was never nervous about before. Or he would
Mm.
tell me, I was driving to work and I had to pull over because I was going to get sick. Or he'd be parked in the parking lot at the office and call me and say, I can't come in. I have to go home. And I
Mm.
didn't understand this at the time. I was angry. What do you
Mm.
mean you can't come to work? And I kept thinking that, his problems were honestly gastrointestinal because he had Crohn's disease.
Mm.
One day, he just walked out of the office and said, "I'm never coming back here."
Wow.
And around that time, my son was also going through some major depressive episodes. And it then came to light, oh my goodness, this is a clinical problem. It has nothing,
Mm.
it's anxiety. And I thought that once he stopped working, that everything would get better, but unfortunately it didn't. He wound up in a terribly depressive episode where eventually I had to call. I didn't know what to do, and I was reaching out to NAMI, which is the National Association for Mental Illness, and those support groups and the resources, and saying, what do I do? Eventually, I get him hospitalized,
Mm.
and he is there for maybe about 10 days, and he comes out, honestly, he was scared and nervous, but his outlook on life was, it was completely different. He
Wow.
was hopeful. He was excited. He was someone who refused to do therapy. Now he was, in groups 3 hours a day. He was like the star student. And
Mhm.
all of us, it was like just this bright light, came upon our family and our house. And 6 weeks later, he was diagnosed out of the blue with terminal blood cancer.
Oh gosh.
And it was it was cruel. It was just such cruel timing. And it had
Mm.
nothing to do with any of the other physical issues that he was dealing with for so many years. And I, luckily, because of my work situation, was able to be with him. He lived almost 6 months to the day that he was
Wow.
diagnosed. And those 6 months, I was, home every day.
Yeah. Full-time caregiver in that scenario as well.
Yes.
Wow. Wow, Debbie, just hearing your story again, because I know I've heard it. You have a podcast and you had shared it. That's where I got introduced to
Oh,
you and your story. And I just thought, wow, like you have seen caregiving at every level and you're still very young, like you have experienced this throughout your life course. And um, I was like, I have to know more. I have to talk more with Debbie because, one, you share your story to help others, which I think is just so beautiful that you're sharing and you're willing to talk about it. And it's not always easy to talk about. I think mental health and caring for someone that is experiencing challenges with their mental health, we don't talk, I think, enough about that and how challenging it can be. And again, you don't always see it like you do a broken arm. So it is more challenging when you're trying to navigate things like work and family life and friendships and just the day to day can be challenging. So any other kind of perspective that you could offer on what that experience is like caring or being a care partner to somebody that has mental health challenges?
honestly, that was by far the hardest part of the caregiving. In my husband's case, he was okay. He had a good attitude when he first learned about the diagnosis, and then something happened. He got an infection. He had to go into the hospital, blah, blah, blah. And he really started to go downhill. So much so
Mm.
that eventually I did have to call the police. And it was a
Mm.
horrible scenario. And he was hospitalized. And he hated me. Now, his mental illness
Mm.
took over, but he, he was, at this point, he was out of his mind. He told me he wanted a divorce. He was very resentful. He was mean. And I think that, you know, my family members during this 6 months and more than the 6 months, really the years leading up to it, and it was due to the mental illness, not the physical illness. They wanted me to leave him because of what it was doing to me. It was so, so difficult to feel that you were giving your life or trying to do what the right thing was for someone, and in return, they're telling you how horrible you are. And even if I know that it's not him talking, it's the mental illness talking, and I've experienced this with my son too, just differently, it doesn't matter. It still hurts. It still hurts. And honestly, I feel so emotional about this because I feel like he died hating me. And it's a terrible, terrible feeling. And I think, what could I have done differently? Because when he wound up going into the hospital, he wound up being hospitalized for over a month. And I think probably he came out with pneumonia that eventually, he died less than a month after being released from the hospital. And I feel guilty. And it's something that I've had to deal with. But it's very difficult to live in a scenario where you're trying to help and someone's screaming at you every day, telling you what an awful person you are and how thoughtless you are.
That is very hard. Very hard when you're pouring in so much, and at times making decisions that are hard, but is in the best interest of the person you're caring for. So thank you for sharing that and being so open, Debbie, about that part of the experience. And guilt is something that I think many caregivers experience, no matter what their caregiving scenario is, because many express, that they feel like they're not doing enough, or they, are second guessing decisions that they're making. And so I think that feeling of guilt is very normal in a caregiving scenario, but it doesn't make it feel any better,
Yes, exactly. I have to say something that we didn't talk about, because I feel like, in listening to myself, I sound like I was the perfect caregiver. The amount of, over the years, honestly, resentment and exhaustion, overwhelm, angry, angry. Why is this my life? What did I do to deserve this? That was my mindset. And what wound up happening was, because I was just really overworked with caregiving, and not just for those who were ill, it's other people in your life, right? It's my other son. It's the people that I work with and my customers. Like, it felt like all day, 24/7, I was just giving, and I was angry. And it took me decades to realize that the problem was, I wasn't last on my list. I wasn't even on my list. And so I so strongly feel that talking about the importance of self-care for a caregiver, we can't talk about it enough, because many of us feel selfish, like, how should I prioritize myself when, my husband, brother, whoever it is dealing with such difficult issues. And I learned that if I had taken the time to do something for me, I wouldn't have shown up as impatient. And honestly, I snapped a lot at my father and my husband. I would have shown up as a better caregiver. And isn't that what we want? So, the idea that it's selfish, that you don't have time for self-care, and it's so much more than taking a bath or getting a massage. And I think people don't realize that. And you can do something for 5 minutes, several times a day, even once a day, whatever it is. But it's not going to happen unless you make it happen. And I think that message is so important, because I see and I saw the difference of how I behaved when I did prioritize my self-care. And it was better for my loved ones too.
Yeah. Yeah, that pouring from an empty cup analogy
Yep.
is so real. So many caregivers feel that utter exhaustion, that overwhelm, and it seems impossible to take that time. And so I really like your suggestion of just even 5 minutes of something for yourself, and showing up as a better caregiver, better spouse, better daughter, better mother. Fill in the blank for whatever type of caregiving you're doing, can help you show up and sustain you. Because I mean, Debbie, you've been caregiving, or you were in that caregiving role and still are for your son in ways, for decades. And for many, that's not sustainable. And I'm sure, I'm just making this assumption. I guess I'll turn it into a question instead. How did this impact your health and your well-being, mentally, physically, over these various caregiving roles that you've experienced in your lifetime?
Oh, my goodness, tremendously. I mean, when I wasn't taking care of myself, I wound up when I was 50, more than 100 pounds overweight. I've always struggled with my weight, but at that point, I think that, that was one of the heaviest. And why? Because I was an emotional eater, right? And I was going and, through so much, not caring for myself. Eventually, when I did start prioritizing my self-care, for me, exercise, of course, it's great physically, but for me, mentally, it is so important. Because I used to do jazzercise and Zumba, like, dancing makes me happy, and music.
Yeah.
So I would walk in all tense and angry about whatever situation I was walking away from. And I would go there and listen to the music, sing and dance, and I would come out a different person.
Wow.
And you have to find what that is for you, right? Each of us, it's different. But that really helped me. But yes, I was always frazzled. I did not take care of myself. And, I don't have to tell you, and I'm sure you've talked about, the statistics of how then the caregiver is the one that gets sick and can't take care of the loved one, right? And funny, now I'm coming into, and I'm not there yet, and hopefully, won't happen, but a different kind of caregiving, because thankfully my mother is still alive. And I live in New Jersey and she lives in Florida, and there's nobody there with her. I have one sibling, he lives in Cleveland. And even though she's okay and she lives in an independent living facility, I've made the decision, I need to see her more often. I need to check in. I know she's very nervous. Something happens, especially as you get older. It doesn't even have to be anything major. It's very scary to deal with it alone. And this is a different form of caregiving, because this long distance caregiving, it's very difficult. And, like I said, thankfully she's basically okay. But I see in my future and hers that things can change.
Yeah, stepping into yet another caregiving role. I think there's that beautiful Rosalind Carter quote of, "You will be a caregiver, need a caregiver, give care, receive care." So, it really does impact us in various ways across our life course. And I think I would think that, Debbie, all of these experiences that you have had in caring for your dad, your son, your husband, you'll be able to apply that to your mom. But yet it's in a very different way. Long distance caregiving comes with another array of just challenges and a different approach, because you're not there day to day and hands on. And so maybe we'll have you back in a few years and talk more about how you've navigated that role. But I'm just so grateful, Debbie, that you have shared your story with us today. And I know that you're continuing to work in kind of this space of lifting up caregivers and sharing your story and supporting caregivers. So can you tell us a little bit about that work?
Sure. So I do have a morning journal, because I have found that taking a few minutes for yourself in the morning really, sets the tone for your day. And that 5 minutes is part of self-care, right?
Yeah.
And so I have a morning sprinkle journal for caregivers with some prompts, and it only takes 5 minutes. And there's no perfect, there's no right or wrong. On my website, I have 2 free downloads. One is the 5-minute caregiver reset, and the other is self-care for caregivers. And that
Wonderful.
self-care for caregivers, it gives lists of, if you have 5 minutes, what can you do? If you have 10 minutes, what can you do? Just gives you some ideas of how you can actually fit self-care into your day. I'm also currently have a book called The Sprinkle Effect, and it talks about sprinkling small things in your life, and they add up to making your life something more colorful and enjoyable. And I'm in the process of writing that same idea or concept, but specifically for family caregivers.
Oh,
And of
wonderful.
course, I, go around the country speaking and letting caregivers know that they're not alone, talking about the importance of self-care. And where you go after, a whole other topic is what happens when you're done caregiving, right?
Yeah, that is a whole nother part of this journey
Yeah.
that, again, I think doesn't get enough attention. And so I'm so grateful that you are sharing your experience, and through these resources, which we will certainly include in the show notes so that folks can connect with you. And Debbie, just again, so grateful for you sharing your story and getting very personal and opening up about all of these various caregiving roles that you have held and continue to hold throughout your lifetime. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Debbie, thank you for your honesty, your strength, and your willingness to share your story so openly. Your experiences remind us that caregiving is not just a role, it's a journey that shapes us in profound ways. To our listeners, if you see yourself in Debbie's story, whether you're just beginning in your caregiving journey or if you've been walking this path for years, know your experiences matter. The lessons you are learning, even in the hardest moments, have value. If today's episode resonated with you, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with another caregiver who may need to hear this conversation. Be sure to connect with me on Instagram at Caregiver Chats Podcast for episode updates, caregiving tips, and more. Thanks for listening, and please remember to take good care of yourself while you care for others. Caregiver Chats is brought to you by Home Instead. If you're looking for in-home care to support you on your caregiving journey, please visit homeinstead.com to learn more.